Great. Okay. Well, first of all, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming. And welcome back to a lot of you. I see a lot of familiar names and faces as well. I also think we have quite a lot of new people joining us for the first time today, which is a testament to the profile of our speaker and his work. For the sake of people that haven't joined before, I'm Rory. I'm one of the early career postdoc conveners of the network, along with Dr. Camilla Penny, Dr. Hannah Baker, Dr. Milena Visaconte, and Dr. Sarah Dryhurst. And we've been running this network since late 2020. And this is now our 17th seminar. And the network aims to connect disaster researchers and people interested in disaster research, not just across the University of Cambridge, but also outside of the University of Cambridge and outside of academia. We're trying something a little bit different this term, in that we want to try and tease out some of the connections between our seminars, because at the end of the last series, we were talking about how there's so many interesting conversations, connections, cross-cutting issues, and ideas that are worth exploring. And it's a conversation we've had a couple of times. So the connecting theme of this term is the very broad question of what causes disasters and what can or should be done about this. I should say that we're not expecting simple answers. It's not a rhetorical question, but we are trying to use that very broad question as a way to connect the different seminars. And today's keynote is going to provoke some ideas and hopefully set the foundation for the next 3 seminars, where we're going to go into detail on the specific topics. So the topics to follow this seminar, the keynote, in 2 weeks' time, we're talking about implications of language on understanding causality and impact. And then 2 weeks after that, we're talking about rumors, false information, and disasters that have never happened. And then finally, we're talking about historical processes and disasters. And again, I hope these will return to the question of what causes disasters and what we can do about it. And they're going to build off each other, we hope, and build off today's keynote. So for the keynote today, we're incredibly lucky to have Professor Ilan Kelman to give a talk. Ilan is Professor of Disasters and Health at the UCL Institute of Risk and Disaster Reduction, or IRDR, but also the UCL Institute of Global Health. And he's published very widely on the topic of disasters, among several other topics. And I'm just going to drop a few links into the chat, including of his 2020 book, Disasters by Choice. So Ilan, there it is on the screen there now. And Ilan's going to present for 45 minutes or so, and then we're going to have a discussion and Q&A at the end. So please save any questions to the end. And we generally wrap up around 4:30. So if you have any questions and you need to leave at 4, please get your questions in early. So now with 54 participants in the room, which is a record for us, I'm going to hand over to Ilan.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you everyone for coming. So what causes disasters? Well, the answer is actually simple. We do. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions. Oh, wait, I have a question, me. Yes. The eminent professor recognizes the obnoxious audience member. As a side note, you might not want to insult the audience. It just looks bad, particularly on YouTube. Oh, thank you so much. So when you say we do, who is we? Ah, yes, a very good question, thank you. And the answer, yeah, it is a very good question. What do we actually mean? But we, meaning we do, who is we? In essence, it really means society. It means us, and we're all members of society, or at least we used to be before work from home and avoid people. But is everyone in society really responsible for disasters? Is it really something that we can all do? Even if we think about, the disaster, which we sort of call a pandemic, and a pandemic is when a new disease emerges. Oh, right, we know all this. So who is really responsible, for example, for the current pandemic? It was known it was going to happen. There had been coronavirus pandemics before, in fact, in our lifetime. SARS from 2002 to 2004. There had even been a pandemic between the 2 coronavirus pandemics, H1N1 flu in 2009, And of course, pandemics are steeped. Human history is steeped within pandemics. So all society really could have known or did know that this would happen. Is all society responsible? Even if we take the UK and its obviously magnificent management of the COVID-19 pandemic, in 2016, the UK ran a huge exercise called Exercise Cygnus about the UK's pandemic readiness. And it concluded the UK's preparedness and response in terms of its plans, policies, and capability is currently not sufficient to cope with the extreme demands of a severe pandemic that will have a nationwide impact across all sectors. Well, to be fair to them, at least I got that right. So when people were saying the UK is not ready, here's what we have to do, and that's not taken into account. When people started writing a report post-SARS in order to say, here's what we need to do for the next coronavirus pandemic, and the report in effect wasn't published, it just reached draft form, and then, oh, well, you know what, SARS is long gone, so don't worry about it. Who is really responsible? I even stood on the north shore of Nuku'alofa, the capital of Tonga, on that seawall, looked out across the lagoon and said, I hope there's never a tsunami here. So am I responsible for not being able to change things in the intervening years? We all have different resources, different approaches to knowledge, different limitations, different interests. When we take the trite, simple, succinct answer, what causes disasters we do, who is we? What are the different levels of responsibility? So this, in effect, is thinking about the book which Rory kindly mentioned. It's what a lot of the people on this call are researching and talking about, including all of the conveners of the series who themselves are fabulous, fabulous researchers. Do look at their work because we all have so much to contribute and we can learn a lot from them. And the discussion has to continue among us and beyond. So I've put my contact details into the chat now. Please do connect via social media, continue these discussions and debates because we do not have the answers. And it's all very well and very kind for this network to bring me here and to talk about my achievements. It's all very well for, me to sort of joke about me being an eminent professor, but we don't know everything. We all have things we should have done better. We all need input from you. This is where we think, well, where are we starting from? Where are we going? How do we improve? And thanks so much for the kind comment in the chat. Great to see the book is getting out there and is used, but there's always things to improve. And in fact, 3 major factual errors we did correct in the paperback edition, which is just about to come out. This is an advanced copy of the paperback edition. So there are now about 311 shopping days until Christmas. So remember that they sell them by the dozen, and go ahead and see how good cockroach killers they are, how good doorstops they are, and hopefully start the debate, but do not end it. And when we start the debate, whether through a book, through an academic paper, through your academic careers, or thinking about an academic career, because I know there's some PhD students on this call also, we do try and start at the beginning, with academics being absolutely wonderful about debating definitions and language, as we're going to see in a future seminar, but it is part of it. Even if we think about the name of this network, of this series, Imagining Risk, and that word imagine, we are currently speaking one language here, English, or at least one bizarre variation of it. But there are many other languages, connotations, cultures, interpretations. What does disaster, what do synonyms of disaster mean within those? How do people respond positively or negatively, depending on the vocabulary we use? And we talk about all of our wonderful highfalutin words like this, the holistic resilience of social ecological systems. Well, that doesn't mean anything in English. Imagine trying to translate that into other languages, other cultures, other contexts. But we are speaking English here. So, and we are using this word disaster. So if we start at the start, if we begin at the beginning, what is a disaster? And that's really where I began the book. In fact, that's really where I began my academic career in disasters. What is a disaster? Which intriguingly is quite a different question than what is the disaster? Because if we're saying, a country has just horribly been flattened by a tsunami, which we knew was coming, the world has been devastated by a pandemic, which we knew was coming. Is a disaster really the fact that a tsunami caused damage? Is the disaster really the fact that a virus, a new disease, and responses to it caused damage? Or is the disaster more fundamental? Is it much more long-term, thinking to far back into history, long into the future? Is it trying to understand again, who is we when we say we cause disasters? But that was more a bit of foreshadowing. So that was sort of hinting at the conclusion, but we have to start at the start. So we're still back to this question, never mind what is the disaster, what is a disaster? And I thought, well, how can I simplify this? That's very bad in academia. You don't want to simplify in academia, but I decided to be different. So what would be the fewest number of words that I could use to define a disaster in English? And I came up with 7. A disaster is a situation requiring outside support for coping. 7 words. A situation requiring outside support for coping. To me, it works. When I try and work across languages, when I speak to people about different languages, it's translatable, it's sort of intuitive. You can talk to people in the street about it, and it does make sense. There's obviously vagueness. A situation, outside support, when we have, say, a pandemic affecting every country, what is outside? We're not hoping that aliens or Zeus are going to come down and save us. So what does outside support mean in the context of a global disaster? And also coping. Is that all we want to do? Just get through, just surviving, day to day, it's all the same? Or do we want to do better? Do we want to thrive, not survive? Nonetheless, it's a starting point to think about how do we interpret it, how do we translate it, how do we connote it in different contexts, and also try to say the fact that, okay, something happens, and it could be at an individual level, or it could be at a continent level. The people who are directly impacted cannot cope with it, so they have to have an external intervention. They have to have someone who has not been affected coming in and supporting them. So fine, a situation requiring outside support for coping. Fairly straightforward, because we don't all have the power we would want, desire, or be able to use. We don't all have the resources which we would want or desire or be able to use to save ourselves from whatever is impacting us. We don't all have the opportunities or the choices or the options to say, no, I don't want to live here. No, I don't want to be affected in this way. Okay, I'm going to do this. This is a fundament. This is about us. Resource allocation, equity, equality. Who's oppressed, who's marginalized, who's discriminated against? Why is it that some people make a choice not to get away from the flood or cannot make a choice to get away from the flood? So whatever happens, people are placed in situations, in circumstances where something happens and they cannot deal with it themselves. Simply put, it's a disaster. And for me, the multi-scalar aspect is an advantage. Yeah, an individual can go through a disastrous situation. I suspect we've all been through that in some way and often don't necessarily want to even think about it in that context. But it does happen at the household level, the community level, county, city, municipality, as well as country, continent, and of course, a planet. So fairly straightforward, fairly simple, kind of. Because there's 2 components comprising disaster, 2 inputs into why people end up in a situation which requires outside support for coping. And I hope you're all thinking about these words. Anyone quick on the type? Anyone quick in the chat who wants to give me one or both of these 2 keywords which input into disaster risk? Just thinking about bringing it down to fundaments. What are the 2 key concepts? And I will give you hints. They start with H and V. So we have hazards and vulnerability, but interestingly, we did get the E word before exposure. And this is the difference between me being awed by trying to simplify and academics being academics by complexifying it. Because do we really need exposure? When I look at the definitions, I find that vulnerability and exposure basically overlap. It's also disciplinary, particularly in environmental epidemiology. There's actually very clear differentiation. But when I look at many other disciplines, particularly those affiliated with disasters, I often find it very difficult to really delineate vulnerability and exposure. So I just say we can use three complex words like hazard, exposure, and vulnerability, and then we have to explain, define, debate, and discuss them. Or we can just say, you know what, let's let vulnerability encompass exposure, keep it easy, keep it simple, and then we only have two bizarre words that we have to explain, define, and discuss and debate. And hazard is particularly curious because many languages don't have a word for hazard. When we even try and define it in English, it's almost like the potential for something bad to happen. Potential hazardousness is a hazard. We also have to recognize that the V word, vulnerability, is key, that is core. So there are so many phenomena out there which are only hazardous because there is vulnerability, right? So if a flood happens, but you're ready for it, it is not an issue, your business isn't interrupted, your livelihood isn't disrupted, there's no casualties, the flood actually may be advantageous. So it's not really a hazard unless there's vulnerability. And exactly by the comment in the chat, there is absolutely these issues of mixing words and increasing ambiguity by trying to throw in extra words like hazard or exposure. So we're all familiar, though, with what we call hazards, whether it's floods, landslides, we've mentioned tsunamis, viruses, diseases, tornadoes, near-Earth objects, potentially striking like asteroids or comets, solar flares, but none is necessarily a hazard unless there could be potentially disaster, unless there's vulnerability. So in a sense, we can not only drop exposure, we can drop hazard and just say, well, vulnerability is a complex word. So disaster effectively equates to vulnerability, keep things straightforward, keep things simple. That may be too simple. So let's keep vulnerability for the moment and say, well, then what is vulnerability? Well, it's sort of the potential for something, someone, somewhere to be harmed, to experience damage, to have problems, which is completely subjective. So Russia has done very well over history by ensuring that damage did happen to its enemy from weather. At least 3 times Russia has been invaded and won by a combination of appalling military tactics from the enemy, good military tactics from Russia, and the winter. So in that sense, the winter weather was hazardous to one party directly affected and was not so hazardous to another party directly affected. One party had a lot more vulnerability than the other. One party was willing to accept vulnerability to make another party vulnerable. So you can see how the machinations start to get difficult to actually sort out not only what is hazard, but what is vulnerability. But we are aware that people die. Infrastructure gets hit. There can be major disruption to life, livelihoods, and business. That is vulnerability. But it's not just a snapshot. It's not just saying, ooh, let me look at this house and say, okay, the roof will be damaged in this way by this sort of event and the windows this way. Why was it built like that? Why, when you know that tornadoes happen, do you build a house which is going to be destroyed in a tornado? Why do you not build a tornado shelter when you know your house is going to be built by a tornado? That decision does not happen quickly. That decision does not happen overnight. That decision is a long-term societal process, bringing together people, politics, expertise, technical aspects, social aspects, building codes, planning regulations, laws, legislation, taxes, voting, non-voting, corruption, so that one house happens to be in a location at a time when a tornado happens and it gets destroyed and there's no shelter. That is a long-term process. We're talking a generation, if not more. So vulnerability is a long-term societal process. You cannot go out, take a photograph and say, okay, there's vulnerability. We have to understand why that image captures what it does. We have to understand why people and infrastructure are in situations and locations that they are. And that is generational, that is cultural, that is societal. So disaster equating to vulnerability being a long-term societal process, means that disaster is a long-term societal process. The phrase slow onset disaster is superfluous redundancy, which isn't needed, because all disasters are slow onset. And the phrases fast onset disaster or rapid onset disaster make no sense. We know that some of the environmental phenomena, some of the so-called hazards happen quickly, like a tornado. Some happen more slowly. But the environmental phenomenon is not the disaster. The disaster, right? Not a disaster. Vulnerability is. So vulnerability disaster always happens slowly, always accrue over the long term. To really understand why, we have to delve into history. We have to go back into time, and to act on it, we need to think long into the future. This is rather theoretical, throwing out words, thinking about languages and definitions. What does it mean practically? And that's exactly as a point, the comment in the chat is that the answer is also thinking about different timescales. And it's not just that people are saying, well, I gained today, so who cares about tomorrow? Sometimes they are thinking about the long term. There's absolutely nothing wrong with, the soil is great here, right? What was a phrase? The foothills of major active volcanoes. The soil is great here. So of course, this is a multi-general decision to put my farm here. Even if I know the volcano is there, I can decide that if it erupts over the next 100 years, we'll die. Or I'm going to look at warning signs, be prepared, have an evacuation plan, be ready to lose everything and return to nothing and rebuild. And that's a perfectly viable disaster-related strategy. So this comment in the chat has been brilliant, because it's really brought it down to the practical aspect of someone saying, why am I going to settle here, whether I know the hazard or not? And it may be because they're thinking about today, not tomorrow. Or it may be that they're making a rational, logical statement about today and tomorrow, saying, I will accept the risk, take the hit, and be ready. As we know, though, as the years go on, as the decades go on, that rational, logical decision to take the risk, take the hit, and be ready morphs into, well, it didn't happen yesterday, so it's not going to happen today. Yeah, I know there's a volcano there, but you know what? I don't remember it erupting. My grandparents don't remember it erupting, so what's the problem? And this is that long-term cultural transition, which then creates a disaster or the disaster. We can take another practical example, and I saw very kindly in the audience that Robin Spence is here, and I'm making the presumption that is the famous Robin Spence of Cambridge, who actually was one of the key people who brought me into this field, be taking a hazard or risk, taking a risk in terms of bringing me in as a PhD student, and then kindly supporting me through that, as well as through my first postdoc, because Robin is one of the world's eminent, really eminent professors in terms of earthquake engineering. So we can talk about earthquakes and the fact that he and Emily So have just had a book come out, basically, why do buildings fall down in earthquakes? And what can we do to stop it? The key being, we know earthquakes happen. We know why buildings fall down in earthquakes, and we know why we can stop that happening. It's our choice. But as Robin knows, being the engineer, you don't construct a building, you don't plan, design, construct a building overnight. It takes a long time, and particularly if you're adhering to codes and making it professionally designed, those codes take a long time to be developed, promulgated, monitored, and enforced. So what good news do we have from earthquakes? Well, we can go back to 2001, February 28, 2001, where Seattle and Washington State experienced a 6.8 moment magnitude at a depth of 52 kilometers. Not enormous, but big enough. It would be felt. And what happened to Seattle was basically a handful of deaths, none from structures. The handful of deaths directly attributed came from cardiac arrest. There were maybe 2 which were directly attributed, but then they experienced a spike of cardiac arrest deaths in the weeks after the earthquake, which they think they can attribute to it. I mean, that's remarkable. A fairly major city experiencing, you know, a moderate to major earthquake and basically no structural deaths. Well, it's because Seattle had spent more than a generation trying to get ready for it. So number one was structures. And they'd actually reinforced a lot of key structures. Every single bridge which had been retrofitted withstood that earthquake. Many bridges which were slated for retrofitting were severely damaged and had to be closed and then shored up. A couple of structures, including the air traffic control tower, did experience a lot of damage, but didn't collapse, so didn't kill anyone. There was also an element of luck. The night before, in one of Seattle's old districts with a lot of brick buildings, there had been riots. So the police had gone in and cleared it, and that sector was effectively off limits when the earthquake struck. Those buildings were not ready. Bricks rained down on the streets, crushed a lot of cars, and would have crushed a lot of people if the district had not been shut off. But again, it shows that buildings which were thought about in terms of earthquakes managed, and those which didn't manage. The other element was social. Seattle has also been a world leader. It's also been a world leader in terms of preparing people to deal with emergencies. A program called Medic One set out to basically give every single person in the Seattle area the opportunity to learn CPR, basic first aid. It's not just about saying, oh, am I doing 15-2 or 30-1, which helps and saves lives, provided you have the chain of life there, like advanced life support defibrillators and hospital care. The key with first aid is not so much the sequence you go through, but the mentality of I can deal with an emergency. I'm not going to freeze. I'm not going to put myself in danger. I'm not going to put other people in danger. And having that as a cultural mentality, not just giving everyone a first aid at work certificate after 1 day or 3 days, but having that mentality of emergencies happen, I can deal with it, is fundamental to saying when something happens, how can we avoid harm? How can we avoid that need for external support? And then there was a sort of a third factor which combined the infrastructure with the societal. And that was an American project called Project Impact, which had been implemented by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, to say that businesses could combine with local governments to try and implement certain measures to avoid mainly building collapses or building damage in disasters. And quite conveniently, of course, this was 2001, President George W. Bush had just been inaugurated in January. And quite conveniently, that week of the Seattle earthquake, it proved how small investments could have huge paybacks because some very clear project impact implementation had been done in Seattle and saved lives. And that week, George W. Bush, just before the earthquake, decided to cancel Project Impact. Again, the disaster is us. There was no reason to cancel it. It had proved its worth in terms of lives and money, except the logical, rational reason for canceling Project Impact was that it had been implemented by the previous administration. And the previous president was Democrat, George W. Bush was a Republican, so of course we have to do things which are new, which are different. The disaster is us. But back to good news. It's not just Seattle. Northern Japan, 26 September 2003, experienced 8.3 moment magnitude at 27 kilometers depth. You will feel that. And boy, did they feel that. And the death toll was less than Seattle. It was 1. Someone was cleaning up glass afterwards and got hit by a car. 8.3. And basically shallow and basically no disaster. Then later that year, 4 months, 22 December 2003, Central California, very similar to Seattle's actually. That was 6.5 moment magnitude, a lot shallower at 8 kilometers. Yeah, you feel it. Death toll was same as Seattle, that was 2, because 2 people in a building ran outside during the earthquake. Don't do that if you think the structure will stand up. You drop, cover, and hold. You don't try and escape. And a clock tower, which had not been properly reinforced or retrofitted, collapsed on them and killed them. The owner of that building was later found to be legally liable for their deaths. So again, reasonable earthquake in a place which has a long history of seismic reinforcement and the culturally ingrained regarding earthquakes, and major hazard, major to moderate hazard, and no disaster. And then 4 days later, 26 December 2003, an earthquake almost exactly the same as California's. That was 6.7 compared to 6.5 at 10 kilometers depth compared to 8 kilometers depth. That hit southern Iran, and the death toll was 25,000. Adobe buildings collapsed. The city of Bamiran is a World Heritage Site. Built from Adobe buildings collapsed, crushed people, suffocated them. Basically the same earthquake parameters as in California. One, there was no disaster. One, there was a disaster. Iran has some of the best earthquake engineers in the world. Iran has some of the best seismologists in the world. In fact, cultural gaffe. I get this email from Tehran saying, oh, I'm such a wonderful disaster researcher. Could I come and give them a keynote presentation, invited? They would pay for everything. And I actually replied saying, well, my primary interest is actually islands. So cities don't hold a lot of interest for me. But the real issue is that you're coming from an institute which knows far more about this topic than me. So you know what you're doing. You have the earthquake engineers, you have the seismologists. I really have nothing to tell you. That response didn't go down too well. I should have been a bit more diplomatic, but really, I have nothing to teach Iran whatsoever. But is it their fault? Are they the we that 25,000 people were killed and bombed? Are they the we that in February 2004, over 500 people were killed in another earthquake in Iran? Are they the we that Tehran could be the first million-death earthquake that we've recorded in human history? Who do we call out? Who do we blame? Like I said, I've learned so much from them. They are wonderful, wonderful scientists, engineers, and would love to be practitioners helping their own country in the world. But in the same way that the UK has some of the best pandemic experts in the world and long has, and we've still been crushed by COVID-19, at what point do we say we've done what we can as scientists, we've done what we can as researchers, we've done what we can on Zoom, on YouTube, and actually somewhere, somehow, those with more power, those with more authority, those with more resources need to start getting into the decision-making context. What it does show is we can deal with earthquakes if we want to. And Japan showed that on 11th March 2011. Absolutely massive earthquake, one of the top 5 ever recorded in human history. High rises in Tokyo were swaying back and forth because they were designed to. If they didn't sway back and forth, they would have collapsed, killing thousands. But they didn't, so people got seasick, but we didn't have thousands of deaths in Tokyo in the earthquake. And even in northern Japan, where the earthquake rattled the most, there appears to be very few deaths from the earthquake. This should be a resounding success, showing over generations, built out of catastrophe, the 1923 earthquake, but nonetheless a resounding success over generations, how we can save lives in absolutely massive earthquakes. Except pity about the tsunami. Difference between hazard and vulnerability. Difference between an environmental phenomenon and vulnerability. And as many researchers have pointed out, Japan had 1,000 years of knowledge on tsunamis. Yet still over 15,000 people died, even though you can download the videos with the announcements going out saying a tsunami is coming in, move out of the city. And then you see the cars driving into the wave. So can we take that lesson from earthquakes and translate that into tsunamis? And not just for Japan, even for the UK. Because any coastline, it has vulnerability to tsunamis. And we are probably less prepared for a tsunami in the UK than we were for a pandemic. So this is why the disaster is vulnerability. It is a long-term process. It's these political decisions of saying that we do not want to deal with what the environment throws at us. We are thinking about today, not tomorrow. And maybe sometimes rightly, we actually are saying that we don't want to deal with it. We'd rather take the hit and then move on. And we're seeing that a lot again in the UK with the pandemic, with these pronouncements that the UK is going to be the first country to exit the pandemic. And the pronouncements that, yes, our prime minister got through it. And yeah, okay, they made mistakes, whatever, but they led us and they managed. But look at the death toll. Look at the disruption. Look at the number of people who have died because they could not get healthcare because of the pandemic. If we're going to deal with ourselves as a society, if we are going to say, actually, no, we do want to ensure that basic services are functioning within disruption, this is dealing with disasters. This is saying, yeah, things happen, but can we get through it without external support and stopping cancer treatment? I mean, it really is appalling about how everything was anticipated and how so little was ready. The story of which continues across so many other environmental phenomena, those which we influence and those which we don't. And the big one, of course, is climate change, which we see everywhere. Even people saying, yeah, the 2004 tsunami, the 2011 tsunami, even the Tongan tsunami, these are the disasters which are coming because we are changing the climate. Wait a minute, they were tsunamis. Volcanic eruption, earthquake. Yeah, okay, the Earth system is connected. Bill McGuire from UCL pioneered the links between tectonics and human-caused climate change. And there are links, and we're going to see more of them. But to try and say that living on a coastline in a tsunami inundation zone is because of climate change is just nonsensical. But moving away from the tectonics, moving away from those hazards, what about weather? What about climate? Can we actually attribute disasters to climate change? And we have to go back to the definition. So we're looking at hazard and vulnerability. Climate change by United Nations definitions, and I say that plural, there's 2 official UN definitions of climate change, gets complicated, but both of them start with the premise that climate change is a change in the climate, which has logic to it, especially for the UN. Well, what is climate? Again, academics define, and climate, the definition is very clear. Climate is average weather. It's actually a statistical construct. Climate, in effect, has almost no physical meaning, no tangibility, because it's a mathematical calculation. Again, thinking about languages, not all languages even define climate, even differentiate between weather and climate. But we do in English, and we have a very clear definition: climate is average weather. Do we have a word for average climate? Do we have a word for average earthquake? Do we have a word for average landslide? Weather seems to be very much ingrained in our consciousness, as it should. But weather is merely the environment. Weather is merely hazard, whether we modify it by human actions or not. By definition, weather does not cause disasters. Climate comes from weather. Climate change is change of the climate, which is change of average weather. Hence, by definition, climate change does not cause disasters. Can we apply this theory in reality? Well, let's take some recent ones. Whenever there's a weather event, people attribute it to climate change. It's absolutely fascinating. Whenever people are killed, whenever there's a disaster involving weather, people say, well, this is climate change, just like the tsunami. Well, we have to look at the science. So mid-December, tornadoes rip through the US, kill an just astonishing number of people when we know exactly what we should be doing. And of course, people said this is climate change. So it didn't take me long to do a quick literature search. I discovered that in the Southeast US, there is a second peak of tornadoes in late November and early December. So the main peak is in May, but the second annual peak is actually around that time. So December tornadoes, even a huge outbreak like the one we saw, was not unusual. Emergency managers, they say, you know, the tornado season in the US, it only runs from January to December, but not in between. Basically saying tornadoes can happen anytime. And so to say that this was an out of season tornado is actually factually wrong. Similarly, they had warnings that morning. The local National Weather Service offices were issuing and tweeting warnings that there was going to be something big that day. Their language became increasingly histrionic, and quite rightly throughout, until just before the tornadoes formed, they said, "This is dangerous, find shelter." And the main town in Kentucky, which was flattened, 20 to 30 minutes before that tornado ripped through, they tweeted, "Get out now, find shelter. There's a tornado on its way." And again, this is Tornado Alley. The real issue is, why were there not shelters? Why do people not have access to the warnings? Of course, not everyone's on Twitter. Understandably, not everyone has the information. They may not even speak the languages. This is vulnerability. Given that the death toll was not 1,000, we can take some modicum of caution that it was impressive in terms of the number of people who got warnings and the number of people who found shelter, the number of lives not lost. But to have that number of deaths is really, really devastating. Nonetheless, it was far, far from the worst death toll in US tornado history. And so again, it just shows, despite the fact that population has increased, despite the fact of urban expansion, it shows how many lives were saved. So this balance of saying a tornado death cannot be linked to climate change. We don't even know how human-caused climate change influences tornadoes. It's really, really complicated, and they have all sorts of difficult parameters to try and analyze. But why do people jump on this notion of climate change causing that tornado disaster, rather than workers being told, "I know there's a tornado warning, but if you don't turn up, you're fired. And I know there's a tornado warning, and I know we have a tornado safe room in our factory, but if you go into that room, you're fired." Allegedly. I need to keep on putting allegedly. So the real issue is, why do people not get the information? Or why do they feel there are bad consequences if they do not take into account that information? None of this can be linked to human-caused climate change. This is all cultural, societal, long-term vulnerability. Same with the Marshall Fire, the Colorado fires. Again, my social media filled with, "Wow, fires in December. Where was the snow? This is climate change." So I went onto the hazard plan for Boulder County, and I discovered that the areas which were burned almost to the line were marked as high fire risk. In that area in Boulder County, it's the lee side of the Rockies. So yeah, you get snow dumps of like 1/2 meter, meter and a half, but then it melts in a couple of days. So not having snow on the ground in December is actually fairly typical. And then of course, again, fire season runs from January to December. So yeah, you don't get a lot of fires, but you do have to be aware of them. Even the preceding days, which were very unusually warm, very unusually balmy for Boulder County, the weather records are online, and the maximum temperature hit during those days was not even close to the record. And we're talking the record over about 120 years. So yeah, no one's denying, no one should ever deny that we are changing the climate rapidly and substantively. No one should ever deny that this is affecting the weather and it's going to have severe impacts. But to take a fire, to take a tornado, to take the Western European floods of July 2021 and say it was climate change, misses the fundament of disaster, misses the fundament of vulnerability, misses the long-term choices which those with power, resources, opportunities made to place people in those locations at those times, often with perfect warning information, which they did not or could not act on, to the point that they died, with exceptions. And the exception with human-caused climate change is heat and humidity. A typical heat wave, everyone should survive. The classic ones, right? Chicago 1995, Paris 2003, London 2003, and 2019, and 2000, and yeah, plenty. And we do get deaths. But everyone should be able to survive because those deaths are analyzed and shown to be because of social isolation, because of inability to take care of themselves, particularly at night when it does not cool down, through fear of going out to the park to sit under a tree from crime. Even in Chicago 95, they knew many people who were vulnerable. They went round knocking on doors to see if they needed help, but people didn't answer the door because they thought that they would be attacked. Crime isn't linked to climate change. Crime is societal. But human-caused climate change is changing this. It's pushing heat, humidity into regimes, which basically we cannot survive. So when it gets to that certain level, if you're an outdoor agricultural outdoor agricultural worker, you either die or you lose your livelihood. If you're a construction worker, you either die or you lose your livelihood. If you're making these cheap clothes that we love to go into shops and purchase because you're a worker in a tight garment factory with no artificial cooling, you either die or you lose your livelihood. And what climate change is doing is pushing us into heat humidity regimes which we cannot survive, particularly not cooling down at night. Now, yeah, okay, so we could give everyone 24/7 artificial cooling, we'd survive, but who wants to be indoors all the time? We've just tried it since March 2020. Some people manage, some people don't. And anyway, artificial cooling is very energy intensive, so we'll just contribute to climate change. And again, the most vulnerable workers, like agriculture, construction, garment, don't have that option of simply being indoors 24/7 with artificial cooling. So they're dead, or they lose their livelihood and they migrate. And human-caused climate change is pushing us into these areas where we are going to experience these devastating high mortality heat waves, which we've never before experienced. And it started. We've actually saw that in British Columbia over the summer where it almost hit 50 degrees Celsius. The death toll appears to have been over 600 people. And it's fairly evident that a good proportion of those deaths in a disaster can be directly attributed to human-caused climate change. But people weren't calling this out. They weren't saying Sicily set a European temperature record, British Columbia is broiling. What they said is, look, southern British Columbia, Vancouver's cut off. The main highway is being cut by floods and landslides. The town in central British Columbia burned to the ground. This is climate change. So it took me about 3 minutes to find a compilation of all flood and landslide disasters in southern British Columbia from the early 19th century to the early 21st century. Rain in Vancouver is not unusual. And it turns out that the same town which burned in central British Columbia had 3 major fires in the 1930s and 1940s. So why are we focusing on fires and floods and landslides and tornadoes when heat humidity is going to have mortality in the thousands? And it started now. So yeah, the rule is that hazard, environment, climate change, earthquakes do not cause disasters. But for human-caused climate change, one big exception is heat humidity, which will dwarf many of the others. And there are many other exceptions in terms of quite severe, serious, and highly impactful consequences of human-caused climate change, which could actually be causes of disaster. So it's kind of this balance, right? And when we communicate, it's sort of this tough line of scientists always saying might, could be, perhaps, as opposed to sort of the one line which garners attention, whether it's simply disaster by choice, we're making choices, or climate change does not cause disasters, well, apart from all the exceptions, or disasters are not caused by the environment. What we can say irrespective is the tagline, and Kevin Blanchard is on here, so you should look him up and look up his website and his work, that disasters are not natural. Of course, Kevin and I did not originate this idea. We are not the ones who first said, stop using the phrase natural disaster. Whenever you see it, call it out, try and stop people using it. This goes back before Kevin and I were actually born. This has been a fundamental baseline tenet in disaster research, policy, and practice to stop using the phrase natural disaster. And yet we still see it all the time. And both Kevin and I do take some flack when we kind of respond politely and say, hey, do you want to just call it a disaster rather than natural disaster? And yet 95% of people are reasonable, and the other 5% is quite amusing. But join us. Just politely use the resources, create your own, to give these fundamental issues that disasters are not fast onset. The environment, even when human modified, generally does not cause disaster. And disasters are not natural. So it basically means we can drop phrases like disaster event. These are a long-term societal process. They are not events, even when the hazard is event. We can really challenge these phrases that we use to try and ingrain, to try and instill the more complicated concepts about why we can drop words like exposure and hazard, and why we can even just talk about these long-term societal processes, which then led to individuals, infrastructure, people, communities simply being hit by a fairly typical environmental event, which we could deal with, but we generally choose not to. We generally choose not to. So we're sort of now back to we. And rather than what is a disaster, what is the disaster? And yes, people are dying. People are being injured. People are having their livelihoods taken away and devastated. Infrastructure, which has stood for a long time, collapses. Should not, cannot, is not being rebuilt. Cities are experience upheaval. People have their lives completely turned around. So what is the disaster? Is it the fact that an earthquake collapses a building? Is it the fact that volcanic ash collapses a roof, that a flood blows in windows and doors? Or is it the disaster the fact that we've put people and infrastructure in these situations and circumstances where they're harmed in a multitude of ways when we know exactly what we could and should do to stop it, but the long-term, wider power plays of societal machinations deliberately, explicitly, and directly remove options, opportunities, resources, and possibilities for people to help themselves and those around them. That is why we cause disasters. That is why we can do better, and we all have plenty to contribute, but also recognizing that so many of the choices, so much of the disaster by choice comes from all these situations far beyond what we would want to influence, far beyond what we could want to influence. And the baseline cause of the disaster are these long-term power issues, which make people, force people, put people into vulnerable situations and circumstances and wants them to stay there. Or not. Thank you. Looking forward to your questions, your challenges, your thoughts to see how we can all do better in the science, but in the science communication and action. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much.